to hear an echo. I don't hear the echo yet. It's always this paranoia of mine where I want to make sure we're live because I've messed up in the past. Let me quickly double check.
Oh.
Awesome. I can hear the echo and we can get started. Before we start, Ines, do you watch Marvel movies?
Not really. I don't watch movies a lot.
Okay. But there's this superhero Captain Marvel. She's from like another universe. She's super awesome. And I wanted to bring that context because whenever I'm introducing you, it feels like I'm introducing Captain Marvel. That's what.
Okay,
that's
no,
what. Sorry, I was just going to say that's what it feels like to introduce your background because you've accomplished so many awesome things.
Oh, okay. I'm sure you can. I trust you that you're picking a good, I don't know, reference or analogy, even though I haven't watched the movies.
But yeah, for the audience, thanks for joining us. I quickly want to introduce Ines, and like I said, she's, if I may, Captain Marvel of the coding universe. She started coding at the age of 11 by designing websites, and through a career path, she eventually ended up, luckily for all of us, in open source world, creating projects for NLP and AI. We probably know her through her Spacey contributions and also as a founder of Explosion. Many people don't know this, but Spacey is backed by Explosion. That's the company behind it. We'll be asking Ines all questions around that. And to the people joining us on YouTube, this is the forums where I'm looking. And if you want to ask any question, the pinned comment should take you here. And all you have to do to ask any question is just hit reply. And just leave a comment here, and I'll be going through them in sequential order. Awesome. So I guess I'll just go in a random order. These might not be the most organized, but I'll try to keep them organized. I recently saw that The Guardian shared they use Prodigy or Spacey for finding quotes in their article. Are there any particular examples of the products you built that you're particularly proud of and some that you're not the most proud of?
Oh, that's an interesting question, especially the not so proud of. I mean, there have been really cool and interesting use cases. And it's funny because this is a question I am asked a lot and I'm always struggling to really people always want like, I don't know, something like super magical AI or something that sounds like incredibly fancy. And the truth is that like a lot of the use cases that have been kind of exciting have also been sort of, they don't sound very exciting. They're often quite boring. Like there have been interesting uses in fact checking, in like various also journalistic areas. There have been very interesting projects done in like the healthcare domain, but often actually where, you know, the technology makes has a big impact in businesses. It can often be like automating something relatively boring or making internal processes more reliable. And that's not everything is as like fancy as, oh, cool, The Guardian uses Spacey and Prodigy, but I also always want to make sure that like all these other projects also get, you know, some recognition, or it's not just, it's not just all that stuff that sounds maybe more, sounds super exciting. And I mean, sure, about the things we're less proud of. The thing is, I think you can extend this a bit more to the general like ecosystem. There are obviously use cases of NLP that are very problematic. And of course, you know, we don't always have an influence on what people use our software for, but in general, we do, for example, for commercial software, we do not sell to organizations that are primarily involved in military and intelligence, and that because that is something, especially in the government area, that's not regulated. In private companies, it is. In government use cases, it's not. And so that is something I'm very wary of, and where I think you know, we should keep an eye on how technology is used there and create a framework around using the technology responsibly and not for things that have a potentially very bad outcome.
It's also such a controversial topic, right? Like someone might say you're patriotical and you want to support your own country's military, but then you're like technically going against humanity. I don't want to get into like a super controversial topic, but it's also, it also gets really spicy for some people.
Well, sure, but I think for government, the main problem is that there is no regulation. A lot of the projects are secret. We do not know what people are working on, and there is much more of a mechanism for private companies and for like the open market. And these use cases are regulated, and government is not. And I think that is, even aside from what people are actually working on, I think that's one of the biggest problems.
But again, this is another hot take of mine. I also assume many people tend to overmarket things. Maybe machine learning isn't that heavily used, maybe not in the most advanced manners in most of the places.
Well, sure. I don't know. I mean, I think everyone wants to do something with machine learning, but the truth is, okay, they are very great use cases where it can really make a difference, and there are other use cases, where it can't. But I do think, especially when it comes to information extraction, natural language understanding, that's an area where actually the technology is already delivering a lot of value in companies, as opposed to maybe other use cases that are a lot more like experimental, or it's like, some company has some innovation lab where they're trying out something new that might or might not lead anywhere. But, there are a lot of use cases where a lot of value already comes from machine learning.
Also, sorry for going on that tangent, but to bring back the original question, like extending it a bit further, is there any one single project that you're the most proud of that Spacey has helped accomplish? I'm sure there would be a lot. Maybe you could pick a few.
I mean, I think more generally, I would say I'm definitely very proud of Spacey having helped a lot of people get started with NLP and actually go from doing just starting out exploring the technology to building like really powerful and really advanced systems. And that's also something we've been trying to do with the software. There've also been really cool projects that are basically built on top of Spacey and provide these very task-specific pipelines that I think are really cool. For example, there's Spacey by Alan AI, who've developed a pipeline with lots of different components for the biomedical domain. There's a project called Blackstone, which did the same for legal text. And in a lot of these projects, a lot of work went into designing these individual NLP components, very specific for the task that they're solving. And so that stuff I think is very cool, and especially because these projects are also open source, so you can like go and download them, use them, maybe adapt them for your own projects.
Awesome. I as I said earlier, this will be quite haphazard since we have questions in all different directions. I'm trying to organize them. It'll still be a bit random, but for the people joining in, please keep the questions coming. This is for you. This is not an interview that I'm getting to host, so please keep the questions coming. Going back to your early days, you have a very pragmatic view of how you approach projects. You've talked about this in the EuroPython conference as well. I absolutely enjoyed that keynote.
Oh, thanks.
So when you start with any project, possibly in the open source domain, or let's say when you got started on Spacey, how did you improve from there as a coder yourself? How did you make that conscious effort?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like, so I'm not a person, I don't learn very well from like courses or books. So I really need to be actually doing things. And so for me, it's always helped to really have a project or something specific I'm trying to solve. And then I'm like, when I get really excited about doing something, I get like really into it and I spend a lot of time doing it. And for me, that was kind of the best way to learn things and to get into, NLP more generally. Or when I started working on Spacey, I don't know, I don't typically sit down and just learn something. I'm like, okay, I need a project. And then that's also the best way for me to learn new things and try out new technologies, even now.
So Saurav extends this question further, like how do you find the motivation for that without any external factor? So if you're working on a project, how do you motivate yourself?
I mean, I do think it does come, it does have to come from, I don't know, the inside. And, I probably couldn't be doing that job if I was like just not interested in computers or not interested in programming. I think then I would be, in the wrong profession. So I do think I'm lucky that, okay, this is something I enjoy, and I do tend to get quite excited about things if I find something that I want to do. And yeah, I feel like even working remotely has really worked well for me. I never thought, I would find it relatively easy to just, be at home and motivate myself to do stuff. But yeah, I think it's always been a hobby of mine. So I kind of found a way to turn the things I like into a job, and that's how I stay motivated.
What was the origin story around Explosion? Was this through the consulting business that you started? Like you said, you follow your passions, and someone is also curious about how did the name Explosion come about?
Oh, okay. So basically, the quick story is I did have a background in linguistics, have a background in development, but I initially I didn't go like the traditional computer science route. I ended up meeting my co-founder Matt, who was actually writing Spacey at the time, and we realized that there's kind of a lot of stuff we have in common, and I had a background in this, and I was interested in this, and so we started working together on Spacey, and then quite some time later we were like, we should really start a company around this. And the plan of Spacey has always been to turn this into a commercial business. So it wasn't like the case that it was an open source project that ended up being popular and then someone was like, how can I make money from this? Like the idea was, hey, there's a lot of demand. People were interested even in my co-founder Matt's research code when he was in academia, and he was like, they should really, for industry use cases, you need something better, you need something more performant, you need something that's really designed for real world use cases. And that's kind of how Spacey was born. And so we started Explosion shortly after that. And the idea was, we needed, to bootstrap and fund the company. Back then, a lot of the typical investment routes, it wasn't very attractive to us. It didn't seem, it wasn't very compatible with the sort of thing we were doing. It was always very important to us that, it's the project, the open source project and what we're doing was sustainable from day one, and we wanted to have a profitable company. And so
your KPI was profit, as you mentioned.
Yeah,
in the Europython
exactly.
conference.
And I think that's still true. I mean, that's still how we operate. And I think money does not lie and profit doesn't lie. And you can lie to yourself for a long time, but if you're actually making money, which I think a company should, then that's the most straightforward way of looking at it. But so we did what we call we raised the client round. So we basically saw, hey, there was a lot of interest from companies, and we could just do some projects for them and also get to know the use cases better and see what people are working on, what people really need. And that's what we did with Explosion for the first 6 months. And then we released our first commercial product, Prodigy, and we're funded off that. And actually to answer the Explosion question, I think we were just like brainstorming words and terms that were sort of related. We wanted something that vaguely fit into the sort of the space terminology that we already had for Spacey and some of our other other tools. And the domain was still available with .ai, which was obviously a big factor. And so we settled on Explosion.
Awesome. That's I think it's also some founders say that they're also searching for a name that's available, and these times a lot of names are usually taken. Maybe were you also thinking like you wanted to create an explosion in the AI world?
Maybe or even at the time there was this term like the AI explosion, and I don't know, it had like it does have positive and negative connotations, but it's so I do think it's a very dynamic term. And in general, actually, if you look at like how we're calling our projects and tools and things, we always like to choose words that have like some sort of meaning, but everything's kind of mostly a word that exists or some play on a word.
Makes sense. Continuing on the previous question, how did you decide these lines of product? This is a question by Ayush. And Explosion went from Spacey to Prodigy. Then think, what was the decision-making factor behind this?
Yeah, so I would actually say Think was kind of around before Prodigy, because it was always kind of the machine learning library powering Spacey. We just made it a separate library, but it's kind of part of that ecosystem. But basically for Prodigy, even when we were doing the few client projects at the beginning of the company, we saw that training data was like the number one thing that was holding people back. A lot of people would just outsource their data collection to Mechanical Turk and then wonder why the data they got back was like not so usable and low quality. And people really didn't spend enough time engaging with their data and breaking down their problem. And we knew we wanted an annotation tool. We wanted to create data for the things we were working on. So an annotation tool was very high on our list. And so we focused on that. We built the type of tool that we would have wanted to use that was programmable, and that also kind of reimagine some of the general annotation workflows to make them efficient. So data scientists could start by creating some data themselves before scaling things up. And that's how Prodigy was born. So we really saw, annotation was like incredibly important for what we were doing. It was a very natural follow on from Spacey, because hey, if you're also as a commercial product, if you're a power user of Spacey, if you're a power user of machine learning more generally, you almost always want to train your own models. And to train your own models, you need data, and then you need some way to create data. So Prodigy is was kind of a very natural first product.
Well, this was also right around the time when Mechanical Turk was taking off, right?
I think Mechanical Turk's been around for, much longer, and also it's still used in like academia, where people have other, budget constraints or like other ways of creating the data. But I do believe that like this kind of idea of outsourcing annotation is something we will look back on the way we look back at on outsourcing programming. Like data creation is part of the development process. Data needs to be developed just like your code needs to be developed. And I do think also people often underestimate the work that goes into designing your annotation schemes and designing what your model should predict, which is also something that's quite different from academia. If you're researching, you usually start off with a predefined data set, and you're also trying to build data sets that are quite hard so that you can compare your algorithms on them. In industry use cases, you don't have that problem. You can actually make your problem easier, and that's usually the way forward. You think of something you want to solve, and then you think about how do I break this down into machine learning components, and how do I break this down into components that predict something that's as straightforward as possible, and something that I can annotate without too much ambiguity. And even if there is ambiguity, how do I deal with it? It needs to be consistent. Otherwise, there's no way a computer can learn this. And these are all decisions that, you have to make when you're building a model. And that's also what Prodigy tries to emphasize. So I think even when you're reading about people's annotation processes, or this Guardian use case that you mentioned earlier, that was a cool article, and they really spent a lot of time explaining how they had journalists and they had a task that sounded pretty straightforward, like annotate quotes in text. Most people would think, oh yeah, I know what a quote is, that's easy to annotate. But once you actually start working on it, you find all these edge cases, because language is complex. Language is not unambiguous. That's the whole point, and that's the whole difficulty. And so then you start annotating this. So you're having all these discussions. Or from a different annotation project that I think my co-founder was involved in, they ended up spending hours discussing whether the forehead is part of the face. And you can discuss that in a group of people, and maybe some people agree, some people disagree, and this you need to come up with an answer. And that's why it's so important to really spend some time with your data. And the other nice thing is nowadays, back in the day, people still had this like big data idea where you needed millions of examples to even get anything done. And now we have transfer learning. We don't actually need massive data sets. We need good data sets. And you can actually train pretty good models with like a few hundred annotations. So that's not the problem anymore. You don't need to like scale it up to infinity, but you need good workflows, and you need iterative workflows. And that's more important than just the sheer volume of clicks and that's also why these outsourced or click worker solutions are becoming less interesting or less relevant for industry use cases, because it's not about the cheap click work. It's about the quality of and how well it fits into your machine learning workflow, basically.
Yeah, and the reason I brought up the Mechanical Turk point, because from what I was trying to understand historically, at the time there weren't many options, and I was trying to understand if that was one of the reasons you saw this clear missing block in the community, and maybe that was one of the core reasons for creating Prodigy.
Yeah, I think definitely, or we definitely saw that outsourcing annotation and outsourcing data creation, data is the core of your model, that outsourcing that was not a really viable way for industry going forward. Just like outsourcing programming is, I think most companies now understand, is not the right way forward. Most companies hire development teams, and it's very important to have a lot of your development in-house. And I think the same goes for data. And there are also other concerns. A lot of companies, people working in the healthcare domain, you don't want to send your data to other people's servers. You want to work on your own infrastructure. You want to have a tool that that isn't like invasive and collects all your data or sends all your stuff to other people. So that's another consideration where it's important for us to have tooling that people can run on their own infrastructure.
And earlier, for the people who joined us, I was just sharing the live demo on the website, and I was just showing them how intuitive it is to actually go through this. And it, in hindsight, I guess it was also one of the reasons that since you bootstrapped the business, it was so easy for you to create this model where you sell a one-time license. Otherwise, it's so hard to actually see this across many industries where you just sell off the license and the developers can work on it without using a centralized server, or which is common across many services.
And I think it is something that speaks to developers. Like, it's kind of this old school model where, like, back in the day you could buy Photoshop and then you'd have it. And I think even less about the licensing, it's more about the kind of open source feeling of a tool, or like the programmability. Because I think, again, also when talking about open source, a lot of people have this misconception that companies like open source because it's free. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Companies and people like open source because it's programmable. You can install it. It's very easily accessible. You pip install a package, you clone something from GitHub, and you want to extend something, and you can write some code to make it do what you want. And I think that is one of the main appeals of open source. And that's also what we are trying to accomplish in other tools, even if they're not free. I don't think that's the main motivating factor. It's that they're programmable, they're straightforward, they integrate into your development workflow. And that's, I think, what people want. And that's also why we initially built Prodigy this way.
I mean, I wasn't a part of those decisions, but without getting too much producty, that's also one philosophy I believe Weights and Biases closely follows for the product. One thing I'm really curious, and I've also asked you earlier, but I'll ask again since the audience is also curious, as I was sharing the Prodigy screen, and this is one thing we've seen across your slide decks, your videos. Where does that strong sense of aesthetics come for you? Your even your software is like artwork. So where does that intuition come from?
I think it's just something I've always enjoyed. And, as you mentioned earlier, I got into programming through making websites, and, it's just something I've always liked. And I do think it was also something when we started out, there was a bit missing, and where I felt like, oh, cool, there's actually a lot to innovate on the UI, user experience more generally, and, the polish and, usability of stuff. And it was always something that interested me. And I was like, oh, cool, there's actually a lot of stuff to do. And, the web is very powerful. The browser is very powerful. There are a lot of things, we can do to make it easier for people to use software. And I think that's definitely, it's definitely been one of the main, things we've been focusing on. And also actually one of the things I'm definitely proud of, that we've been able to come up with kind of a good level of usability that people like, and it actually makes a difference.
Does extra effort go into that? Because we see many products that are, I'm just speaking as a user, we see many products that are great but don't look so good. So is that like a super conscious effort where you like to spend extra time, extra efforts to make it better looking?
I mean, sure, like it's, but it's also, I think it's kind of, it starts earlier, that it's kind of core of the development process. Like, we don't build things by like, okay, building like a really hacky version and then rewriting it all to make it nicer. Like, I do think it's just part of the development workflow that we have a certain standard of how we want things to look and work. And also we always expect that we're not just implementing what people want. We do always need to innovate or think about like, okay, what do people actually need, and how can we make this better? Because often, even as a user, I might be like, oh, this tool could be better, or it doesn't quite do what I want, or I want a tool that does X, but then then maybe some tool comes along that does something completely differently, and I'm like, oh, this is great, and it really really takes this extra effort, and you can't just go around and ask users, what interface do you want, and then a user tells you what interface they want and you build it. I don't think that's how you build good products. It takes a bit more work. You need to actually understand what the user really wants and what the user needs, and what the best abstractions that are actually useful for a very broad audience of users. And that definitely takes takes some extra effort, but I view that as like just part of what we do.
That again boils back to your pragmatic mindset, and you've also shared this again in the keynote. I watched it a few times, so that's why I remember it so well. You shared where each team member is like either complementary to each other, or they like a generalist where they all have the similar mindset and complementary skill sets. So I think that also goes to attribution to that.
Yeah, I think also that's something we can do as a relatively, so with a relatively small team, you can really take advantage of people's, individual skill sets, and also, maybe skill sets that don't fit into like the vague classic job description of a machine learning engineer, because that's also not me either. Like I have a lot of different skills that, maybe won't fit any standard job description, but like I can make it work. And I think so as a company, we can also make that work and use people's skills in that way. Yeah.
I also loved how you responded someone from the audience without like making them look bad. They asked, what are your thoughts about hiring a junior developer? And you said there's no such definition, because everyone comes with different experiences from life, and you have to value those with your company's values.
No, that's true. And I think even now, yes, we hire people at different experience levels, but I do think, yes, you can hire people with less experience, but then also as a company, you should be committed to teaching them things. Like, you can't just hire like cheap programmers and exploit them because they have no experience and are cheap. Like that's also not great, but yeah, no, it's true.
Okay. Now, this is a shift from topics. This is more on the leadership side. So I've organized the questions onto there. The first question is by Thomas, I believe. What personal sacrifices have you made throughout your career? Maybe as a leader as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question. I mean, the thing is, I want to like prefix this by saying that, okay, I am very privileged in the position that I'm in. Like, I'm not going to sit here and talk about how like, oh, look, my life is so hard because I work all the time and I do X, because I'm also incredibly privileged that I can, run the company this way, and we're doing something that makes an impact. I happen to, or we all, probably most of us being here, happen to work in an industry where our skills are very valuable, and that is, that's a privilege. But like, sure, there are pros and cons of being self-employed and running your own company. One of the cons is clearly that, well, you're kind of always working, you're always sort of engaged in things in a good way because it's something I enjoy, but it's also it does take over your life to some extent, and but on the other hand, I benefit from this a lot because it's my business and it's my company. But it can be tough that also things become very personal. Like everything is very personal. I can't turn off my computer and not give a shit about the company and then show up to work again the next Monday. Like that is a difference from a lot of other models, but yeah, I wouldn't say I have made like a lot of sacrifices in that sense, also because I do enjoy my work. Or even when maybe my friends will be like, you're sitting on your computer all day and you sit on your computer all weekend, and I'm like, yeah, I call this recreational programming. It's like what I do for fun. It's like, I don't know, I was talking to my personal trainer once, and he was all like, yeah, he's like, I can't understand how you just sit in front of your computer all day. But then we realized, he's like, I'm like, what do you do on a weekend? He's like, well, I go for a run, I go for a hike, I go swimming. And I'm like, yeah, see, it's like, it's kind of it's a similar thing. It's just what I enjoy. And it's also my job.
I'll definitely
arguably it's less healthy than like, I don't know, going for a run and swimming and spending all your weekend being active, but still.
It's more fulfilling though, I'm guessing for you, and I feel the same to some extent. It's more fulfilling in a way.
Yeah.
I'll definitely use the term recreational programming with my coworkers whenever they try to complain next time. Moving on to the list, what's a leadership lesson that you've learned that's unique to being a female leader?
I mean, also I will prefix this with like, I don't know who asked this question, and this is not a personal comment towards that person, but I do think one of the main lessons is that I'm being asked about what it's like to be a female founder when this shouldn't happen. Or like it shouldn't be a question that people ask. I know it's still something people ask. I know it's still something people focus on. I know it's, there are lots of contexts where this comes up, but I think the main lesson is like, oh, just because I'm female, suddenly everything's about me being a female founder instead of just a founder.
Sorry about that. I think they should have clarified.
No, I mean, no. Also, like, just to be fair, like,
yeah.
No,
I totally understand.
Those questions have been great. They have been like thoughtful. I'm not saying, this wasn't like a diss.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's what
but there was another question about COVID. Actually, the COVID answer is quite simple because actually we did not. This also leads into like the remote work stuff. We actually didn't have to adapt very much, which again is also, we were in a very privileged and lucky situation, but we've always been remote. We've never really had like an office, like at least a fixed office. We have people all over the world. So it was kind of, as bad COVID was in a lot of other ways, and also on, personal level for a lot of people in terms of work, it was pretty straightforward. Or I feel like, oh yeah, I've been training my whole life for this, just being at home in front of my computer. That's what I've been doing before, and that's what I'm doing now.
Are there, if I remember correctly, the team has grown a lot since the last time I got to interview you. So was remote first always a mindset for explosion? And what do you usually look for when you're trying to grow the team or hiring members?
So definitely, I think being a remote team was definitely, a quite conscious thing. It's also kind of how things develop. We meet a lot of good people. We kind of don't want to, we don't want to be so invasive to people's lives by like telling them where they need to live for their job. I think it's actually great if people can be wherever they want to be and be from, be in whichever country they happen to live in and do a job if they're good. I don't want to limit the choice of people to people who want to move to our city or one of the few cities that we've picked. So that was definitely, a factor. We wanted to hire good people. We've actually, we've had a list, we had kind of a list of people that we've worked with, that we're also in this very fortunate position that there's a community. We didn't have to put out a lot of hiring calls. We were just able, when we're in a position to hire more people, we were able to just reach out to people we knew and be like, hey, do you want to work with us? And a lot of people were like, oh, cool, this is awesome. And we had a lot of people we were very confident in hiring because we'd seen their work. They've been active members of the community. They built stuff that was public, and we were like, oh, cool. And so that it did feel, this round of hiring felt very, very natural to us.
Any tips for someone who's trying to follow a similar path, where they're trying to create a portfolio that gets your attention, for example, in the future? What should they do?
I mean, that's also an interesting question because, it's a bit tricky because on the one hand, I don't want to go out here and tell people, oh, you should just spend all of this time working for free, open source, and publishing your things in order to get noticed. Because this is also, a privilege to have, that you have all this time to do unpaid work to get a profile online. But I do think there is definitely, there are a lot of opportunities out there to build things, extensions, plugins, little open source projects. And that's certainly something we would look at. And, kind of how people write code, it doesn't even have to be like, fancy projects and fancy papers, but just, some level of creativity, some level of problem solving. And I do think, open source, or just the ability to publish things open source does make it a lot easier to have something to show. And for example, we don't typically do coding interviews because, we think, I don't know if we could, we've never really done whiteboard interviews ourselves. I don't think it's very useful, especially, talking about having people with these complementary skills, having people with maybe slightly different skills, coding. There's nothing we would learn from a whiteboard interview about that person. It's something you can do if you Google, where you need a huge pool of people who are very similar and they, you want to meet a certain standard. But if you're a smaller company, it doesn't actually tell you very much. So what we usually do is we do a project with someone, we kind of work together, we see what it's like working together, and then it's a much better point to decide that, hey, let's keep working together.
That sounds like a much more thoughtful approach as well. Google, I was reading, or any company at that scale for that matter, like needs to hire at least thousands of engineers just to keep the headcount, and for that reason, they have this standard approach. And I'm, if I may, for like a smaller company like Explosion, I'm sorry, I'm speaking on your behalf. It's a smaller team, so you need more ownership. So it's a totally different mindset, if I may.
I think, of course. And I think also there, even you can go a lot bigger than that. And I still think, I don't know if not everyone is Google. And I think that's, a lot of startups started copying whatever like the really large tech companies did, because it's like, oh, if they're doing it, it must be right. I don't think that always applies. And it ties back into this idea of, well, you need to reason about what you're doing. I think that might have also been one of the takeaways from that talk that you were referencing. We've also always done things differently. We've bootstrapped the company. We've always done things slightly differently from the startup playbook. And it means that, well, if you're doing things differently at every step of the way, you have to reason about things. There's no playbook you can follow to be safe. Everything has to make sense. And so, we actually, we're not, at every step we're thinking about, well, what's the most reasonable way to solve this problem? Or what's the most reasonable way to hire people? What's the most reasonable way to do that? And then we have to do that. And of course we have to be right, because if we're wrong, that really sucks. So, and that's the magic of running a business. It's like you have to make lots of decisions every day, and you mostly have to be right in the decisions you make.
As the CEO, do you spend a lot of time just thinking about these ideas, or what does your day? I know you still code a lot. I was going through a GitHub profile, and it says you still contribute so much code to Spacey. But as the CEO, when you wear that hat, what does your day look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that, because it's definitely like there has been this more transition phase where, okay, I do have to get used to like just not doing everything myself, basically, because that used to be in the very beginning. That's how we started. And I do think that was very healthy, because it means, we've always been very close to the work we're doing. And I do think it's very healthy if even people running the company have a very close idea of what the company does and how it's done. Because I think a lot of cases where things don't work out, the problem is that you have the engineers being very disconnected from the people making the decisions. But I think at the moment with our team that's been growing, we have more people now, we have more projects in the pipeline. So a lot of my work also consists of, reviewing things people have done, coordinating things, and, making sure that all the projects move forward, giving my opinion on things. And then there's still some, I'm still involved in some of the support. I'm still involved in, talking to users, still involved in some software development. And, I do like writing code, but yeah.
What's, if I may, what's one of the like tricky parts of your job as leading the company, or as the CEO? What's one tricky part?
Tricky part? I mean, I don't know. It depends on what you mean by tricky. Like, it's
challenging, if I may.
Challenging, yeah. I mean, I do think the aspect of, okay, I'm not, I can't just do everything myself anymore. There is a point that you get to where okay, I have, it's other people are doing a lot of the work, and I kind of have to supervise that and make sure it's going ahead. But I can't just do everything myself anymore. And also, taking a step back and, knowing I can, we have a great team. I can trust everyone. Everyone's doing like an amazing job, and I can just like, hand something off that I used to do, and someone else will do it, and will probably maybe even do it better than I would have done, or has like great ideas and move this forward. But it is, especially if, you've started a company as well, and it's been, based on products that, you've built or that you were very involved in, to kind of, take a step back and also, let like other people take over. That was definitely, that was kind of a learning experience.
I can imagine delegation being harder there, because you just spent so much time as if this was like one of your main focuses for so long, and now you need to zoom out just to be able to do more things.
Yeah, and also as a person, I'm also like, I like to, get hands-on and like do things. I'm not, I'm not very comfortable just sitting back and letting other people do the job. I don't know, maybe that's also me being like German, but it's, they like, I don't know, there's this sort of mindset where like, oh, I don't know, it's less, I felt bad like thinking about, oh, maybe I should hire someone to help clean my apartment. I'm like, no, I'm like, I can clean my own apartment. Like, I'm not, I'm perfectly capable of doing that. It feels like wrong not to do it, but then have to be like, well, look, it is more practical to just have someone else do some of the parts, so I can focus on other things I'm doing. But I do think it's just this mindset. It's less about like, oh, I'm like, I don't think I'm particularly controlling. It's more about like, oh, I want to get involved and help. I don't just want to tell people what to do. But no, sometimes you also have to you have to let go and have to let other people do the work.
I can understand how it's challenging for you. If if I may, you've shown us this different business model, especially with Explosion, where you've sold 5% equity of your company and raised money through that. Does that change anything for you on the roadmaps, or will you still continue doing whatever you've been doing so far and just grow the team?
I mean, actually, it was all like based on the plans we already had, but we were at the point, our next product is Prodigy Teams, which will be a more SaaS-like platform around Prodigy, but with the same data privacy, the same scriptability, and because of all of that, it's a very complex piece of software. It's a complex thing, and we've wanted to get this ready for quite a while. So and we also realized that like we want to get some more people involved. We want to hire some more people, and we also want to focus on hiring a lot of experienced and good people, because I don't think it's it doesn't make sense to just try to be very stingy there. Like we really need a great team in place to make this work. And so that was kind of the motivation. And because we were also we were a profitable company, we were in a position of having a successful business. So we were able to say, okay, we don't need to make some grandiose promises about like changing the world with our AI or something like that, even though, sure, you can have a big impact, but like, we don't need to come up with some grandiose dream to sell to investors. We can just say, here's like an actual business. And we were able to sell some shares in that business in return for money that we can use to hire some more people and to move our plans forward. And that
Makes
was the
sense.
idea.
And does sound very organic as well, to me at least.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also, I think there are some, it always depends on the business. There are a lot of businesses where yes, you need more capital. You need to, you can't just so easily bootstrap in certain ways. Like it all really depends. But like in our case, for the work we're doing, we definitely see a lot of the classic venture capital approaches as not very compatible with the way we're doing things, and also the kind of stability that open source requires. We have told a lot of people that they can rely on our software, they can rely on Spacey, they should be using our tools, and I do feel like we have a certain responsibility to our users. And yes, there might be companies who then turn around and act as if, that it doesn't matter, we're now, I don't know, going for something else. But I don't think that's very fair, or that's very decent to do as a company. It's certainly not a company that I would want to run. So we think this level of stability and making sure that our open source work is self-sufficient and stable is very important for the community and for our users. And that's why we chose an approach like that. And I think it's still, it worked. And yes, it worked well because we did things slightly differently before. We're not, we can't follow any playbook. We're just kind of, doing things that way. But overall, I'm very satisfied. I've also been, very happy that it's, even in, the investment ecosystem, things change. It's been very refreshing to see that there are investors who do understand open source and do understand, how developer tools and open source are kind of different from maybe like other pieces of software that startups were involved in previously, and how it does require a different mindset and require running things a different way, or that our approach makes sense and is reasonable. And so that was also a factor in it.
Makes sense. Let me reshare my screen and continue with the AMA. Someone is asking, when will you release a course for V3 of Spacey?
Oh yeah, actually, this is something we are currently working on. If you want to, you can lurk on the pull requests, because there is a PR up with a deploy preview, so it's pretty much ready. We have it ready for 3 languages, so we're probably going to have that out this week. So it was a very timely question. But the truth is also that it's really just one chapter that's changed, because Spacey has changed a lot over the years, obviously, and V3 brought a lot of new features, but the user-facing API and a lot of the things you do actually hasn't changed so much. So most of the course was still like perfectly compatible with the new version, and only some parts of training models had to change. So that was also something that was quite satisfying, that it's not, we do release new versions and we release a lot of changes and release a lot of features, but it's also been the software has been very stable, and it's not like, we're breaking everyone's workflows and introducing like a completely different library branded as a new version. So yeah.
Over time, have you seen any principles evolve for this API design that you mentioned? Like, you've always been so conscious not to break the user-facing API. I assume it was quite practical in the beginning, but now since it's a bigger code base, are there any principles that you try to follow while trying to maintain or update the internal framework?
So definitely stability is a big point, because again, like I said, like we have been, since the beginning, we've been telling people, hey, Spacey is a library for industrial strength natural language processing, and it's something you should rely on in production. And yes, you can, but I feel like if you say that, you also have to take the responsibility which comes with it, which is you have to, try and not to break people's shit, because that's really annoying if, they're using your stuff in production. It also means that, well, you can't just, have it both ways and rely on the community to fix your bugs. Like we're always very conscious that if there is a problem and we're telling people to use our software, well, if there's a problem, we need to fix it. And it's kind of on us to fix it. And we can't just turn around and be like, oh, it's an open source project. So, it's always great to get people involved, but it's like, you can't tell people, hey, use my software and get lots of users and then turn around and blame it on the community if your software doesn't work. So that was definitely a principle in terms of just, okay, how we organize the engineering. And otherwise, another principle we have for writing code or writing developer tools more generally is what I refer to as let them write code. So the idea is, you want to have tools that are easy to use, but also very powerful. And that's what's at the core of Spacey. That's what's at the core of Prodigy. And the idea behind it is, well, instead of adding more and more abstractions to make things easier, you want to be writing code and writing APIs that people can program with. So, instead of, having to think of everything a user might want, you can provide users with an API that they can just extend and keep working. No developer wants to be blocked by some feature request. If there's an API that lets you add your own database, that lets you add your own function, you want to do that. You don't want to just have to submit a pull request or submit a feature request and wait for someone to implement that. That's not great for developer tools. So this kind of scriptability and building APIs that are extensible has been very important. And I guess also the other idea is, well, some people might tell you that you shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. I'm not so opposed to that. I think you can reinvent the wheel, but you shouldn't be reinventing the road. And I think that's a common pitfall. That's a common problem you can fall into. And I think, and what this means is there is an ecosystem. There is a way of doing things. There are people's workflows. And for example, in Python, they are shaped by the Python ecosystem. And you can, build a great library that does some things very differently and comes up with new ideas for old problems. But you shouldn't want to own people's entire way of working. You want to be building something that integrates with what people are already doing. And for example, Python is one way. You want to follow the way people write Python code. You can provide people with helpful command line tools and helpful things, but you don't want people to suddenly have to use your platform or your operating system or your I don't know, your layer on top of everything. You want people to program like they normally do with some help of your library, basically. So that's this idea of, we never want to reinvent the road, but maybe we'll reinvent the wheel, maybe we won't. But and I think another advantage of that is that for people learning a new technology, it means that there are a lot of other resources. You don't just have to learn a framework. Like I'm usually I know people want to learn Spacey, and we have a course for that teaches some of the basic principles and how the library works. But I do think you shouldn't have to just learn a framework. Like if you know Python, you can, and know machine learning, you can learn a bit about, Spacey's methods, and then you can use Spacey, and you can iterate over an object. You can use what you already know in programming to do something. And I think that's also something we follow in our other tools. So in Prodigy, a workflow is a Python function. The data is queued up by a generator. All of these are things maybe someone doesn't know, but you can learn about. You don't have to rely on us to provide the documentation for it. You can find tons of resources. And if you know these concepts, you can just use things, and you don't just have to learn all our APIs.
On the topic of reinventing the wheel, you said you're not opposed to that. Have you ever found yourself rewriting parts of the code base, or maybe the code base, or just refactoring it?
I mean, sure. I would say we constantly, refactor things. Like when we did Spacey V3, there was a lot of refactoring involved. But I also think, it is important to set up a code base well from the beginning. Like actually, a fun fact about Spacey is that a lot of the data structures, like the doc, token, span, these are all things. They've been around since the beginning. It's one of the first things that Matt wrote when he started Spacey, and a lot of them actually haven't changed very much at all. So a lot of that, and that took a lot of time. And maybe someone would have said like, why do you spend all this time writing these really efficient memory managed data structures, and why do you really care so much about this? Just use like a dictionary and be done with it. But this really paid off to do things well from the beginning, because if you don't, then you really have to refactor everything, and that really sucks. And ideally you don't want to be doing that. But of course we do refactor a lot. We write a lot of code, we change things, we improve things. I think that's a normal part of software development.
Makes sense. I could possibly keep talking about that, but since we're coming up on time, I'd go back to the community questions. We've discussed this, but one thing we haven't from here for this question is how do the brainstorming sessions happen for you ever, or even especially I'm curious about this part as a remote team. How do you make these sessions happen? Over Zoom, over async docs? I'm also personally curious.
I mean, this is a great question, because definitely thanks. I'm glad like the config system. This is definitely also something we're quite proud of, and this did take quite some iterating and brainstorming. And actually for Spacey 3, that was just before COVID. We did end up doing a small team meetup in Berlin where we had the core developers all meeting up, and we did do a lot of brainstorming kind of in real life and going back and forth on things. We do use a lot of planning documents, especially now with a bigger remote team. We basically, we just write down the thought process. And we also think that's very important. If you work on software, you should be able to, write down your thoughts and write down a proposal in that sort of, way, and communicate these ideas. And that's also something we do. And definitely for Spacey 3, there was a lot of back and forth. We did have some calls. We did have, just a lot of, code review and, trying things out, and then, that doesn't work. Because really the idea with the config was, well, we have machine learning is incredibly complex, and there are a lot of hyperparameters, there's settings. Every part of the whole process of training a model, for example, has settings. And previously, if you just write different functions and you pass in some settings, you end up with this problem of having all these hidden defaults. You're not setting one parameter there, and then your whole thing falls apart. Hidden defaults in code were a big issue. And so instead of saying, we're not exposing any of the abstractions, we decided let's just expose them all. You obviously don't have to write down all your config parameters and can be automatically generated, but we want to make sure that every setting is recorded. And settings can also include code, which is another problem you otherwise have. You're just programming in your config, and you end up with too many settings. And so what we did instead was we let you refer to functions in code, and then you can really build up the tree of different objects. You can customize every part of it if you want, but you can also not. And so that did take some time. And I think it's definitely talking, planning, documents, really thinking, it does require also very close contact with the user and what people are like trying to solve and different, use cases, which we're also hoping to do more of going forward.
Yeah, I was curious about that bit. I'm guessing a lot would come through user feedback or through open PRs or issues where people try to tell you of something that maybe in hindsight you wouldn't have thought of, and that leads to refactor or addition maybe.
But I think also just getting, like, really seeing what people are building, like even just the end goal and the types of applications people are building. Because the problem you do have in open source is that you only really hear from people who have a problem, and that's not, and who want to communicate that problem, and that's not always so helpful because it's only one small slice of the usage segment. So we do want to do going forward. We don't want to do more projects where we help users and companies build Spacey pipelines and break down their problems into machine learning components, because we want to make sure that also we're working on software that people use, and we want to make sure that we also stay up to date with what people are trying to do, and we know all the use cases, because we want to be able to confidently build new components that solve new problems that people are having. And what types of things do you want to predict over text? What makes most sense? How do you want to combine them? There's so many questions, and I think that you can only really do that if you get to see real world problems.
Makes sense. There are a few comments about how everyone's enjoying your energy, which I found to be truly incredible throughout all of your talks. But I could keep asking questions to be respectful of your time. I'll just take two last questions from the community. One of which is, do you have any thoughts on the role of linguists in the field of AI?
The role of linguists. So I do think, AI is very broad, but I do think for NLP, there's definitely a need for people who know about linguistics. And I think linguistics is incredibly important just to even understand some of the basics about how language works, and which then influences how we are building systems to analyze language. And I think linguistics helps a lot there. And it's not maybe the number one thing you should be focusing on, or if you're coming into the field from like a more general programming background, or you've done machine learning, you're like, how much linguistics do I really need? It's maybe not the number one thing to focus on, but it's an important thing to focus on. And there is this often when I talk to people, it seems like linguistics is this sort of, if people don't have a linguistics background, it's kind of this secret source of like that people feel like they're missing. Like you often come in and you're trying to solve a problem, you're like, there's something I'm missing, there's something I'm not getting here. I feel like I don't know, there is this structure in the language that I want to take advantage of, but that I can't quite get behind. And I do think linguistics helps with that. It's also something we emphasize in the team. Like a lot of the people on our team have a linguistics background. I think it's very important in a team. And yeah, I also hope that the field should really recognize this more, and this is important.
Makes sense. I'll request the audience to send in one last question, which I'll pick. In the meantime, I'll just point out to where people can find you on the internet. I think one of the top resources would be your website, ines.io, and they can find all of the links. Ines is also on Twitter at _Ines Montani, her first name concatenated with the second name. There's a GitHub, which should point you to all of the projects that she's contributing to. And you could also go to Explosion instead. You could also watch Explosion's tutorials, which I've always found to have the same level of aesthetics across all of them. And I'm personally really looking forward to the next course. There's also the website where you can check out Prodigy and use it if you like. Did I miss anything, Ines?
No, I think those definitely are the most important points. There's Explosion, there's Spacey, we're on like social media. But I think, if you kind of start from one place, and then you can usually find all the other things we're doing if you're interested.
I see one user is typing a question, so I'll give them 1 minute.
Okay, yeah, sure. No, I have time. I don't want to, just use up all of your time. But if you have more questions, I'm here.
Awesome. In that case, I'll probably ask two more. There's one question around. I think it's not clear, but they're asking about models that Spacey is using now. Maybe they're asking about Prodigy, or I'm not sure.
Okay, if you can pull it up, maybe I can read it.
Sure, it's there in the YouTube chat. So I'll have to zoom in a bit.
Prodigy, very nice. Data models that Spacey uses. Oh, you can. So I think the easiest explanation is we have on the Spacey page, we have an API section that gives you an overview of all the model architectures. If that's what you're talking about, if you mean like, oh, what kind of implementations are the different components using? What's the default named entity recognizer? That's all something we have documented in the architectures, and they're all different functions. And you can see, if you're interested, depending on the level of detail, you can see the types of models, how they implemented, but you can see all the hyperparameters. If you really want to dig deeper, you can see the defaults that they use. So I think that's the best resource, because it's also the implementations, they vary by component. We provide some pre-trained pipelines. You can train your own pipelines with different settings. So I think, API docs are the best place to start.
Awesome, thanks. Do you have any thoughts on what's one underrated thing in NLP? I'm stealing this question from a CEO who always asks this in his podcast, Gradient Descent, which you've also appeared on, but underrated.
Was that a question? Did I answer this question before? Because if so, I'm like, oh, I don't remember answering this question before. So I'd be curious what I said back then if Lucas actually asked that question on the podcast. I mean, I do like, well, to kind of stay on brand, I do think data is like, still incredibly underrated, like iterating on your data, focusing on your data, spending time with your data, thinking about, how to breaking down problems and focusing on all the stuff around, how you even solving your problem before you get into the details of picking which model to train or what embeddings to initialize your model with. That's pretty interesting. There's a lot of cool work happening there, but often, this is just like the cherry on top that like makes your project actually go. Like there's so much more work that goes into the whole process, from, thinking about what do I even want to predict at the end? What should my pipeline even do? Which doesn't even necessarily have to map to your business problem. It could be quite different. How should my application work? What do I care about? Do I care about accuracy? Do I care about latency? Do I care about something completely different? And then which components do I train? Which components can I train more reliably? Does it make sense to train something where I predict end to end? What are the advantages or disadvantages of that? Maybe I should focus on predicting very linguistic annotations, all the way through to how do I annotate it? Oh shit, I can't annotate it that way. Nobody can ever agree on what labels apply. Let's do it differently. Oh, there's so much work goes into that. And then on top of that, you have all the work of, okay, how do I make my workflow actually reproducible? That's something where, I don't know, also weights and biases comes in, where like, okay, how do I have a workflow that actually scales up, where I'm not just constantly hacking around on things, or like, when I've changed a bunch of stuff and then I have no idea what I changed, and then I send it over to my colleague and my colleague can't run anything and nothing works. Anyway, there's so much more to machine learning than just, I don't know, training a model or thinking about implementations. And I do think a lot of this should get more attention.
I totally agree with you. To remain respectful of your time, this would be the last question I'll take. Okay. And I was waiting for this one. I think we've already spoken about this, but
they're different implementations. Low resource languages. I think more generally, if you're talking about language, language support, I think the biggest bottleneck is definitely the data, and having data sets that you can train models from that are, that generalize well. And, low resource languages have the disadvantage that they have fewer resources, which is why we're talking about them that way. And so I do think there's definitely, work that can be done in like data sets, or in creating some annotations, coming up, running some experiments. That's definitely also a way that, you can help us. But if you find like, a data set, something that could work well, and you've tried it out and you found the configuration that works, and, something that produces good results, we'd always be interested in hearing about that. And then what's the PhD research? So I'm not really, for the question before that, I'm not so skills for for NLP engineers in level PhD. It's difficult, so I can't speak on I don't know if the question is whether you want to get into a PhD or whether you have a PhD and are looking to get more skills. I don't know. I'm not an expert on research PhDs. About the internship question, we have done some internships in the past, but we also that's actually something I mentioned earlier. We're very conscious of the fact that like we want, if we work with someone who wants to learn things, we want to be able to provide them an environment where they can do that. And so we don't want to take on too many people at the same time and not be able to provide them the experience, because the idea of an internship is not that you are cheap labor. The idea of an internship is that you learn things. And so similarly, it's like, while we do have people working with us who are have a research background, we don't have any explicit positions where you'll be just doing research and publishing papers. That's yes, we can obviously, something can lead to a paper, something can lead to interesting research, but we do want to be very focused on everything we do is focused around making practical things for people to use. It's focused on industry use cases. So yeah, that's what we do. But if so it's really, we're all people, we have like some background in the technology, and we want to think about how can we take what's happening in research, how can we take what people are exploring, what makes sense, what generalizes, what works, what could also work well for industry use cases, or how can we reframe these things and try them out and rebuild them so that they do solve problems for a lot of people. That's kind of the core of what we do.
Awesome. With that, I'll quickly remind the audience, they can find your website, ines.io. They can connect with you on Twitter @_Ines Montani. There's the Explosion GitHub, Explosion YouTube, and Prodigy website. Ines, thank you so much again for your time and for answering all of these questions. It's always such an honor to learn from you. And thank you for all of your community.
No, thanks for having me. Thanks for all the great questions. This was a lot of fun. And yeah, if you have more questions, let me know.
Awesome. Thanks. Cool. I'll end the live stream.